All right, let's hear it. Repeat it, Brock. Repeat his econ joke so everybody can hear it.
Okay.
Corey's got an econ joke for us.
What's the difference between an economist and a computing man with Alzheimer's? The economist.
Whoa, you gotta tell the joke and we gotta think about it. Tell the joke.
All right. So Jorge's got a joke related to econ that he's giving right now. So the question is, what's the difference between an economist and an old man with Alzheimer's? So if you want to think about that for a second. All right, go ahead.
The economist is the one with the calculator.
Says the economist is the one with the calculator.
Pretty good.
Oh man.
Pretty good. We'll wait till 7 to introduce Bryan. Good that he's
All right.
out there.
So maybe this would be only interesting to the people in senior seminar who are reading Predictably Irrational, but I was reading Predictably Irrational earlier for the senior seminar assignment, and I was sitting in the laundromat reading it with my brother and sister there. And I was reading the chapter on people overreacting to free stuff and, people going crazy for free stuff they don't really need or anything like that. Then on my way out, I missed when I walked in, there's a laundry basket sitting there with a sign that says free on it. So I was already laughing, but I told my brother and sister over just to see what they do and say, hey, look, there's this free laundry basket. My brother took it, even though he already had one that he took his laundry there. So
You never have enough one.
Exactly. But it was like the perfect example. And I meant to talk about it in class, but I didn't get the chance to. Crack me up.
Hey, everybody, this is Bryan.
Hello, Bryan. How are you?
Good, just making sure you could hear me. Doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing well today, and we can hear you loud and clear. It's perfect.
Good.
If he wants to set up his screen share, that's fine. We've gone through the agenda.
Yeah, you can definitely, you can do screen share if you need that. For questions during or after the speech, we were thinking we would have students come up here where you can see them on the Zoom room.
Okay.
And this is the only microphone in the room, so we'll just have them come up here and ask their questions this way. If that's okay with you.
Well, yeah, as long as they don't, in the middle of my presentation, get up and start yelling at me for being an idiot, that would be fun.
I don't think anybody in here is going to do that. So.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds great.
All right, perfect. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started once it's 7 o'clock, just so that if anybody's
Maybe some
still,
more people show up, so we'll
yeah, just waiting for people to filter in on Zoom.
still take a picture here. We talked about having a sidebar on the state of Kansas State basketball, but it's better than it was a few weeks ago. So,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say. Other than it's been a long season. At least you've got Missouri to, you got somebody to cheer for.
yeah, we're going to make the tournament, I think. We've had some injuries lately and kind of we've been on a losing streak, but I mean, we've been so bad for so long. In fact, we're going to make the tournament's pretty exciting. So
Yeah.
we benefited from Texas A&M's COVID over the weekend because just playing them would have been bad for our resume. Apparently, they're so terrible. So
Really? That's interesting.
I guess it's counterintuitive. And then instead of scheduling an easy team for our makeup game, we could have played Vanderbilt, A&M, or LSU. LSU is the only good team out of those, but that's who we're playing. We don't want to. We're okay as long as we don't lose any really bad games. So we're just playing good teams.
Yeah. Always,
Tournament,
the time of year when you're on the bubble or close to the bubble is always it's tight, as I recall.
yeah, we've been moving in the wrong direction, but They're gonna make it. So it'll be fun. It's a step in the right direction.
Good.
All right. Oh, we got something in the chat already. There we go.
Okay.
Oh,
Couple more
interested in shirts. Are you, what size? What size are you all? For the shirts, what size are you? Okay, I'll bring a medium to class tomorrow, Hayden. They're $10. They're pretty sweet. Those cost us $25 a piece. These are like really nice shirts. And then Caesar wants, okay, we'll deal with that. Maybe I'll bring it. Okay.
All right. So I will go ahead and give the introduction for our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Bryan Riley. He's the director of the National Taxpayers Union with the Free Trade Initiative. He grew up in Manhattan. He has a degree in Econ here from Kansas State University, and a master's in economics from the University of Southern California. He's been quoted in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal on issues related to trade. And his presentation today is going to be on a case against trade restrictions in the era of COVID-19. So with that, Bryan, we'll go ahead and send it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to click my share screen button here and get this ready to go.
All right, looks good.
Great.
I skipped ahead. Hey, that's what I wanted. So thanks everybody. Thanks for having me there. It's been about a year since I've been back to Manhattan, so wish I were there in person, of course, but that goes for a lot of things. As I'm speaking here, if at any, I know we're going to have questions at the end, but if anything is just not coming through clearly, or you have any burning questions, feel free to say something. I've been working on trade policy for several years, not quite back as far as 1978. But if any of you would like to kind of hear sort of the classical economist description of why free trade is good, this Landon lecture from Milton Friedman is I think very excellent. And I know we're a long way from 1978, but these are really timeless principles. And although Professor Friedman obviously is known as a very conservative or libertarian Chicago school kind of guy, if you were going to look at the what somebody like Paul Krugman would say, or you get a hat of prominent economists and pull a name out, they'd have some differences, but when it comes to trade policy, they would have some pretty common outlooks, going back as far as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and really comparing 2 points of view. One is the view that trade is a win-lose scenario where one person wins and one loses. And if you as a country have a trade deficit, you're losing. And if you have a trade surplus, you're winning, versus a view of trade being win-win. And not surprisingly, to those of you who are there tonight, I fall into the second camp. And any economic transaction, whether it's you buying a t-shirt or me buying something made in Canada, or somebody in Canada buying something from Bryan, those transactions wouldn't take place unless both sides benefited. It's not a matter of one side winning, one side losing. So that's sort of the general background of what I think free trade is. It's just the ability of people to engage in mutually beneficial transactions. Now I noted the title for this talk is Case Against Trade Barriers in an Age of COVID. And it reminded me, I didn't know exactly how long it had been, but it's been one of my communications with Dan was last March 10th. We were talking about the Econ Club, as you'll remember, Dan coming to visit. And he checked in to say, well, how are things looking there? And March 10th, I said, everything's fine. It's going to blow over. Look forward to seeing you. And then about 2 days later, everything started to shut down. So I hope that doesn't destroy my credibility too much for the rest of things. But when I mentioned, whether it's Paul Krugman or Milton Friedman, general support for free trade, you take any econ class at K-State, even KU, UCLA, you name it. Most economists, when it comes down to basically is trade good or bad for countries and for individuals, are going to come down on the good side, that we're better off specializing in those areas that we have a comparative advantage in, and trading for those goods that other countries have a comparative advantage in, as opposed to putting a tariff wall around the country and making everything ourselves. So this is one example of the view of economists, and there have been plenty of other surveys showing the same thing. That doesn't mean every economist out there is going to say unilateral free trade is the best thing for the country. I think many would. Others would say we should have work with other countries to bring trade barriers down across the board. So there's certainly some nuances there, but in general, strong agreement in the benefits of trade. And interestingly, to me, it's not just economists that have this view. Most Americans support trade and think trade is more of an opportunity than a threat. And this particular poll shows the overall population, broken into Republicans and Democrats, obviously, growing support for trade in recent years. But one of the groups that has the highest support for trade, if you break it down into demographic categories, the group age 30 and younger would tend to be at the high end of that spectrum, supportive of trade versus supportive of protectionist trade barriers or high tariffs or other restrictions. So unfortunately, as a result of COVID, the response among many politicians and policymakers has not been to try and expand trade, but quite the opposite, both in the United States and in other countries. So the main trade negotiator for the United States is in the office of the US Trade Representative. And until a month or two ago, when President Biden was sworn in, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer was our trade representative. And he was testifying before the House Ways and Means Committee and asked what he thought we should do in response to the pandemic. And you can read this for yourself, but when he comes out and says, "I'm not in favor of reducing tariffs on the things we need. I'd be more in favor of increasing tariffs on the things we need." That's a pretty extreme view, but it's certainly one that characterized the Trump administration in terms of its rhetoric and in many cases in terms of its policies. And the hope is for free traders like me is that we have a new administration, that the Trump administration's high tariff policies will be an aberration and we'll go back to more of a open trade, working with our allies type of approach. So far, that hasn't been the case, and the Biden administration has really doubled down on some of the Buy American restrictions that were proposed by the Trump administration, and has not committed to getting rid of any of the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed. The Trump administration put tariffs on imports from China, on steel imports, on aluminum imports, on solar panels, on washing machines. And the hope is that those won't just continue as the new normal, but we'll go back to a more open trading environment. So if somebody were to say to me, well, what's wrong with Made in America and requiring that all our protective equipment and drugs are made in the United States? And I'm not exaggerating when I say that there are those in Congress who really believe that all of these medical goods should be made in the US, all our personal protective equipment should be made in the US. And the rationale is that if we have a pandemic in the future, if we have some kind of global catastrophe, we don't want to be so-called reliant on other countries and vice versa. But if you look at the vaccines that we have available right now, the new Johnson and Johnson vaccine was actually developed by their Dutch subsidiary. And many of those vaccines are going to be made in the US, but the first vaccines are being imported from the Netherlands. The Pfizer vaccine, Pfizer, of course, is another American company, but they developed their vaccine in conjunction with a German company. And the first vaccines came from Belgium. And then Moderna, another US company, has a vaccine, and their main ingredients, the main ingredient for the vaccine comes from a Swiss pharmaceutical company. So if we had a year ago implemented a policy of buy American, imports are bad, we don't want to rely on foreigners, we would be in much worse shape today than we are with respect to the ability to get vaccines in order to confront the pandemic. There are other things we can do to prepare for future catastrophes, things like stockpiling goods so that we have them in case trade is interrupted and we need those personal protective equipment. A couple of senators have introduced a bill that would eliminate all tariffs on personal protective equipment, including N95 masks and medical gloves and gowns that are worn in hospitals. That bill has gone nowhere. And in part, it's because there's opposition from those who say that we need to make everything in the United States. And you can, again, read that headline for yourself. So a rhetorical question is, if economists are so opposed to tariffs and the general public is so supportive of trade, why does the official policy seem to diverge so much? And why do we still have a situation where US tariffs have doubled over the last 4 years? We have really high tariffs on a wide range of goods, including t-shirts and clothing and shoes and sugar. And I think one of the explanations for that was made, and I didn't mean it in this way, but this is Wilbur Ross, who is our Commerce Secretary under President Trump. And Secretary Ross, along with Peter Navarro, who is Trump's head of trade and manufacturing policy, whenever they were asked about tariffs, they would often say something like, look, this can of Coke or can of Budweiser, you get a 6-pack, it's only an extra penny because of the aluminum tariffs. Or you get a can of Campbell's soup, it's less than an extra penny because of the steel can that soup comes in. Nobody's going to notice that. So who cares? Who cares if you pay an extra penny on a 6-pack of Coke or a case of Coke or Pepsi or Dr. Pepper or whatever? And that was their perspective. Of course, we sell a lot of cans of Campbell's soup and a lot of 6-packs of beer and a lot of 6-packs of soft drinks. And those small pennies for every amount add up into millions and millions of dollars and billions of dollars. But one of the reasons I think that we continue to have so many tariffs, that if you were to think about them as an economist, you would think wouldn't make much sense. A lot of times the beneficiaries of these protective tariffs are very powerful and they benefit a lot. And they have an incentive to hire lobbyists and an incentive to make political contributions and to lobby for legislation to protect their interests. And they get a big payday, but the costs are spread across the population. So nobody really has a big incentive to lobby because they pay an extra couple cents for a candy bar because of sugar tariffs. It's actually even less than that. So that's one of the explanations for why our tariffs, why we don't have the kind of free trade policy that most of us think would benefit the country as a whole. I was reminded of this earlier this week. The Senate Finance Committee had hearings to confirm confirmation hearings for our new U.S. trade representative, Catherine Tai, who is probably going to replace Ambassador Lighthizer. And almost every senator, rather than asking some broad-based question about expanding trade, and she definitely got some of those, but usually they had some parochial question about a narrow interest in their state. You know, what are you going to do in South Carolina, for example? A senator asked, what are you going to do to help my our seasonal fruits and vegetable growers who don't like to compete with fresh fruits and vegetables from Mexico and Latin America? The incentive is to try and pursue those lines of thought. What I would like to see, for example, if you're from South Carolina, questions about, hey, we've got the at one time the world's biggest BMW factory, and our state depends so much on foreign investment. What are you going to do to make sure that trade and investment trends continue on track? So a little bit of recent history. A couple of the big arguments that come up often against trade are that we've lost a lot of jobs in manufacturing, that we're getting taken advantage of by other countries, in particular China, and that we've been getting worse off instead of better off. Now, if you look at, as I'm showing you here, average tariffs in the US, but in the rest of the world, our tariffs are still lower, but world tariffs have been coming down a lot. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because of trade agreements like NAFTA, like the creation of the World Trade Organization, where, just to be clear, the agreements do a lot of things, but the main thing is they bring tariffs on both sides down to not zero, but close to zero, so that we have more export opportunities and other countries also have better access to our markets as well. So those trade agreements have been very beneficial. But at the same time, in many areas, especially in the Asia Pacific region, countries have unilaterally cut their tariffs because they want to attract foreign direct investment. And they realize, well, the way for us to attract investment is to cut our tariffs so that we can bring raw materials in and make goods and serve as a base to sell those around the world. One of the things that not just Ambassador Lighthizer and Peter Navarro and Wilbur Ross and Donald Trump, but labor unions on more of the other side of the political spectrum have complained about is that our manufacturing sector has been decimated. So this shows manufacturing output. There's different ways of measuring it, whether it's real value added, whether you look at statistics from the Bureau of Economic Analysis or Bureau of Labor Statistics or Federal Reserve Bank, but they all show the same thing of steady, it's interrupted when we have a recession, but the general trend has been towards increased manufacturing production. So how can you say our manufacturing is getting offshored and we're getting destroyed by international trade when our manufacturing output is going up? Well, they never look at output. Never will tell you what's going on with output. Whenever they're in the media, where they're testifying on Capitol Hill, they will talk about how many jobs have been lost in manufacturing, and they're certainly correct to point that out. As with agriculture, in Kansas, we have fewer farmers than we used to have. And there are a few people working in manufacturing now than there were 20 years ago. But the flip side is manufacturing output has been going up. So if you have more output with fewer workers, that's mainly driven by workers being more productive and every worker being able to produce more goods, just like fewer farmers being able to grow more crops. So I'm skeptical of calling that a bad thing. I think it's a sign of progress. Moreover, if you look at the Department of Labor around 2000 started publishing what are called JOLTS statistics on labor turnover. And they looked at in different industries, people leaving jobs, why they were leaving, people taking new jobs, why they were taking the jobs. And at the same time that US manufacturing employment was going down, and the critics were saying, oh, China's taking advantage of us, so we're getting killed in international trade, we need tariffs. manufacturing layoffs were declining. And if you can try to think for a minute logically, well, if we have fewer manufacturing jobs, but fewer manufacturing workers are getting fired and laid off, then the most logical explanation is people are leaving for better jobs. And certainly in manufacturing, the types of jobs that we lost were things like sewing together t-shirts, gluing together shoes, things that were labor intensive, didn't pay a lot, and weren't high quality jobs. That doesn't mean that it was, I feel bad for everybody who loses a job, whether it's due to new technology, whether it's due to Netflix putting Blockbuster out of business. But it's people sometimes when they think of manufacturing, I think everybody's going to be working with robots and doing these real high tech jobs. If we were to we could try and turn back the clock and try and bring back those apparel factories, and the price of clothing would go up, and some people would have those low wage jobs, but other people would pay a price. One of the benefits of trade is not just the fact that we can create new jobs in different industries, but of course that goods are more affordable. And if you look at electronics, if you look at clothing, if you look at toys, all goods that are widely traded internationally, they've become more affordable. Now, I know critics on both sides of the ideological spectrum will say, well, what's it matter if stuff is cheap if you don't have a job? But the fact of the matter is that if somebody in another country sells us a good, if we import a t-shirt from Colombia, those dollars are going to be used to buy an export. Maybe wheat from Kansas, maybe cattle from Nebraska. I don't know, but there are jobs created somewhere else. Now, part of the explanation for why we have high tariffs and there's still political support for protectionism that I didn't mention earlier, is that those benefits of trade, not always, but often are hidden. And you might not know that the reason you have a job is because of the benefits of trade that have created economic growth. Whereas the people whose factory is shut down, it's easy for them to blame international trade, sometimes legitimately, sometimes just as kind of a scapegoat. And politicians too, many times when things go bad, they want to find anybody to blame other than policies created in DC, whether it's regulatory policies or tax policies or anything else. It's a lot easier to say, oh, it's China's fault than to try and look at things maybe that we could be doing better. Now that trend towards lower manufacturing employment that I mentioned that people seem to continue to be obsessed with, actually, I don't know if this is going to be a permanent trend or not post-COVID, but we weren't losing manufacturing jobs after 2010. Now, these numbers are coming out of a recession, so I think you should take them with a grain of salt because we're going to be adding jobs coming out of a recession. But we actually been boosting not just manufacturing output, but manufacturing employment as well. And I don't know that this fact has made its way into the public discourse on what's happening with jobs, and particularly manufacturing jobs. One of the benefits of international trade, and I've just got a couple more points here to make, and I'll open it up to any questions or comments people might have. When we do business with other countries, and particularly when we import a product, they can use those dollars that they earned from selling us something to buy our exports. And if they do that on a one-to-one basis, the trade will balance. But in many cases, they use those dollars for other things. They'll invest in our economy. They will buy US Treasury securities, or they will build factories in the United States, or they'll go on the stock market and buy stock in American companies. Those all benefit Americans and they create American jobs. And unfortunately, it's not considered in the same positive light that exports are. One of the challenges, and one thing I try and remind myself not to do, is use the word trade deficit too much, because deficit has such a negative meaning. And I think any normal person who hears deficit is going to think, well, that's something bad is happening, or something bad's happening and where dollars are getting drained from the US economy, just like if you have a budget deficit or if you're going into debt on your own. A trade deficit is nothing like that. And one of the ways it's often described is you definitely have a deficit with your grocery store. That doesn't mean you're worse off. It means you're getting food that you like. And so when we have a trade deficit, the flip side of that is we have more money coming in terms of investing in the United States than we have leaving. And so the overall flows, the amount going out and the amount coming in are all going to balance out. And if they're buying exports, that's great. But in my opinion, if they're building BMW factories and Mazda factories and Toyota factories and everything else, that's something that we should welcome as well. It's not a loss. It's not a deficit in terms of our economic well-being. So this is the last slide that I wanted to share. And I wanted to share it because I'm not sure how much longer I'll be able to use Trump administration photo ops and talking points as we've transitioned into the Biden administration. But President Trump here is talking to employees at a Whirlpool factory. And the reason he's at Whirlpool is that the Trump administration put tariffs on imported washing machines in an attempt to help Whirlpool and other US washing machine manufacturers compete against washing machines made in South Korea and other countries. At this specific event, President Trump also touted the fact that he was at the time imposing new aluminum tariffs on Canada and other countries. And I thought it was unfortunate if you're a Whirlpool worker and you're making appliances which are made out of steel, and we've got a 25% tariff on steel, and they're made out of aluminum, you got a 10% tariff on aluminum, for him to go there and brag about driving up the price of the inputs for the things they make, I thought was very disappointing. And then if you look at the Whirlpool boxes behind them, you have washer in both Spanish and French, because a big chunk, something like 11% of all those washing machines are going to either go to Mexico or Canada and French Canada. So he's talking to a company that depends on exports and growing exports. If their company wants to grow, there's only so many washing machines we can buy in the United States, and they need to be looking to other countries to export. And my hope is that the Biden administration will focus more on how can we open those foreign markets and create more opportunities for exports, and do more here in terms of domestic policies to make America the best place in the world to do business. And you don't get there, as going back to the first couple of slides, as any economist will tell you, you don't get there by restricting trade and making it and really rewarding those companies that aren't competitive at the expense of those companies that are competitive. So in terms of where we're at right now, that's about as much as I can say. One of the challenges is the Biden administration is so new that usually when they're asked a specific question, what are you going to do on China? What are you going to do about these steel tariffs? They'll make what I think is a very logical and appropriate answer. Well, we're looking into that. We're going to study it. So as much as I'd like them to say it's bad policy, we're getting rid of it, they're taking their time. Unfortunately, his history shows that a lot of times bad policies, like some of these tariffs, once they're put in place, it's hard to get rid of them. And the longer they remain in place, other companies and other industries decide to turn to the government as well and seek their own restrictions. So I'm and by the way, all my comments or criticisms of the Trump administration or Biden administration, they're not Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative comments. They're just based on what I think good policies are. And where I work, our goal is to promote good policies regardless of who may be in office. And I think there will be a lot of opportunities for the Biden administration to do some good things, and just keep my fingers crossed that as we're coming out of COVID, we want to get rid of some of these barriers to make it easier for the economy to grow and for us to get back on track. So I have lost track of time. I hope that wasn't too long, and happy to discuss or answer any questions that you guys might have.
Brian, do you see Jesse's question in the chat?
Let me pull that up, chat. Getting there.
I could read it, I suppose, if I can find my mouse here, which I moved to let somebody in the room. It was basically saying, are there any good reasons for trade restrictions? Is there ever a valid reason for tariffs and restrictions on trade? What was the purpose of the tariff with China? And I might add to that, just because I think maybe it would be more specific. What do you say to people that say, well, we have these intellectual property concerns with China, and maybe we can, I don't want to sound like Trump too much, but win by preventing some of our intellectual property from being violated?
Yeah, so in theory, I'm very comfortable saying there are times when we should impose tariffs. One of the problems is that you can come up with a theory, hey, here's a case where tariffs would improve our terms of trade, or this would give us some foreign policy victory. But in practice, once you start going down that road, you can have a lot of unintended consequences. One example of that is in 1962, during the Cold War, we passed legislation saying we can put limited tariffs on goods for national security reasons. And the idea was, if there was something that was really, with respect to the USSR, a national security threat, we should have the ability to restrict those trade in those goods and imports from the Soviet Union or other countries. So I think that's very reasonable. But the Trump administration came in and they said that our national security is being threatened by cheap aluminum and steel. And so we're going to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico. They removed those tariffs, by the way, but we still have steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies in Europe and our allies in Asia for allegedly national security reasons. And I focus on that national security argument because anytime anybody wants a tariff, a lot of times it'll come down to one or two things: so China or national security. So is it a legitimate national security reason? Well, yeah, we certainly need to consider that. But it becomes an excuse that allows the president to impose tariffs. And by the way those laws work is the president just says, I'm putting 25% tariffs on aluminum, and Congress has no say on it, despite the fact that under the US Constitution, Congress is in charge of taxes and in charge of tariffs. And one of the changes that I'd like to see in the future is that that I think would be really helpful is if the president thinks we do have a legitimate national security threat from imports and wants to put a tariff on, that he shouldn't be able to do that unilaterally, but that Congress should weigh in as well. So China is an interesting case for many reasons. Now, I differ from some of my very hardcore free trade friends, and you guys feel free to jump down my throat if you disagree. But some people would say, look, if China wants to subsidize its steel production and drive down the price of steel, hey, that's great for us, because it means if you're making washing machines, if you're making cars, if you're making anything with steel, we can get more affordable inputs, and we're better off as a result. Now, then the fairness thing comes into play, where if you're a steel worker, you have a case to be made against those kinds of subsidies. The question is, what's the best way to confront those subsidies? Usually, we've had more success, and I don't mean to say we've had success getting China to change in any terms, but when we've worked with our allies. And one of the costs, I think, of the Trump administration's trade policies is we weren't just focusing on China, but we were putting tariffs on our allies who really have some of the same concerns we do with respect to China. Now, it was interesting to me that the trade negotiations that we entered into with China were designed to combat intellectual property theft and technology transfer. There's something called that's often called forced technology transfer, where China will say to companies, if you want to produce here, you have to license your technology to one of our companies, or you move there and they'll just steal it and start making copycat products. Now, one of the ironic things is that if China were to suddenly say, yeah, come here, do business, we're going to have hands off, we promise not to steal your intellectual property, then you would actually have an added incentive for companies to do business in China instead of here in the United States. A lot of people don't seem to consider that part of what the trade administration's goals were. So I think, and I realize this is a very long-winded answer, but another analogy or historical example I wanted to throw in is that when President Reagan was first elected to office, at the time, I'm barely old enough, and well, I won't speculate about the rest of you. You probably aren't old enough. I'm old enough to remember the Soviet grain embargo, where after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, President Carter put an embargo on US grain exports to the Soviet Union. And during the presidential campaign, President Reagan said, that's not fair to farmers. I'm going to get rid of the grain embargo. After he took office, some of his hardcore, more conservative advisors said, you can't drop that embargo because we need to, it would look bad, it would make us look weak, and it would send the wrong signal with respect to what Russia's doing. And Reagan, in the end, decided that the appearances weren't as important as looking at, was the policy effective in changing Russia's actions, I should say the USSR's actions, and no, it was not effective, is what he concluded. And he also concluded it was a policy that was really being borne by one set of Americans, by farmers. And I think you could make the same case for the high tariffs that we continue to impose on imports from China. Have they resulted in China opening up or making any of the changes that we want? I don't think so. In many ways, China is worse now than they were 4 years ago. And certainly, if you look at foreign policy and what's going on with Hong Kong, what's going on with the Uyghurs, I don't think you can suggest, I don't see how you can suggest that the tariffs are doing any good. Now, you can say it would look bad. We don't want to look bad and look like we're endorsing their policies. But I would draw the same conclusion. It's a policy that's really not equally being borne across the country, and farmers and ranchers especially have been hit with retaliatory tariffs and are going to continue paying a price. So we need to look at what's in our own best interests, and not just necessarily some, oh, here's a theory of why we think this would be good. We don't, and you know, we don't, I certainly don't know what the future is going to be with respect to China, but the actions they're taking have been, in my opinion, as harmful or more harmful to their own economy than they have to us or anybody else in the world, really backtracking on the economic reforms that led to their growth. Okay, I can see the chat now.
And if everybody that's on Zoom could just put their name in the chat so I have a record of you being here. And if you want to be added to our listserv, include your email. I think everybody in here tonight in person is already on the listserv, but if not, let me know before you finish. It's good for us to have a record of who's here, and then I'll have it in the chat. So if, yeah, just put your name if you're in the chat. That would be much appreciated.
Hey, Dan.
And then, yeah.
No, I have one more thing to throw out. Is this a good time?
Sure.
So I'm in the chat, I'm reading about t-shirts. And another challenge to those of us like me who are advocating for free trade is people will buy something and it says made in blank. And they think we don't make anything in the US anymore, even though US manufacturing output has been going way up. And it's not like back in the day where something was made in the US or made in Canada or made in China or made in Japan. Things are made with goods and inputs and raw materials and ideas from all over the world. You buy an iPhone, it says assembled in China. So China gets the credit for it in our mind and in our customs statistics. But really all China does is pretty much slap together the high-tech components from Germany and Japan and the United States. This came to my mind when I was reading about t-shirts. You get a t-shirt and it says made in Bangladesh. Well, made in Bangladesh means it was sewn together in Bangladesh, but something like 70% of the value probably came from Americans who designed the t-shirt. And those profits are going to go to Nike or Under Armour or Ralph Lauren. And so so when you see something made in blank, made in another country, that's not necessarily true. They're made in other countries with US know-how, and vice versa. If it's made in the US, we rely on foreign inputs and ideas as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great to know. I mentioned to everybody that they should consider following you on Twitter, because it's always an entertaining follow. I'll put the I won't put the @ but Free Trade Bryan is the Twitter handle, and I would recommend that. And I know that you fight a lot of different battles there and bring up a lot of different topics. And if there was one thing that either it gets to be the most frustrating in terms of trade or just most misunderstood, I mean, I know there's the Jones Act, there's the sugar tariffs. I don't know, would there be a hill to die on if Brian Riley had a hill to die on when it comes to trade? That's my question for you.
Yeah, I don't want to open up. You mentioned Jones Act. I could talk for 15 minutes about the Jones Act, and we'll be happy to at some other time. The idea that imports destroy jobs is, and that exports are good and imports are bad. That's the hill to die on for me. When people can realize that we're actually better off if we can import bananas from Brazil than trying to grow them in New York. And as a result, we can sell our Kansas beef to other countries as well. That while it's easy to look at jobs that were lost, and by the way, there have been so many studies. We lost this many jobs due to trade with China, and what they will do legitimately, and some of these are great, very interesting economic studies. Let's look at those industries that competed with China and where they lost jobs and see how many jobs were lost. But they never even try to look at the jobs that were created by exports, that were created by all the investment in the US economy. That's a lot trickier thing to do. So unfortunately, that's something that's a battle that's probably not going away anytime soon.
Any questions from the audience?
Hey, and I'd also mention, if I wasn't clear, that Milton Friedman lecture, for those who are curious, it has the audio and the written transcript at the K-State website, or if you go to YouTube and just Google Milton Friedman, free trade producer versus consumer, there are clips there of his explanation of free trade. So just something to consider.
Okay. Any questions? Well, and I've gotten into the habit maybe the last, I don't know how many years, of showing Friedman interacting with Phil Donahue to a lot of my classes, because it holds up so well, and it's so well presented in a very easy to understand manner. But we have a very interested group, but I don't see any questions from the audience. So if we don't have any, I guess we'll we've got one. Do you want me to repeat it, or do you want to come up? All right, Cade's got a question.
You talked about working together with our allies, so I was just wondering what his thoughts were on the TPP.
Sure.
And maybe if he was the one making the decision.
Okay, so basically, Rance is asking about working with allies, and I think I have a good idea of this, but what your thoughts at the time were of TPP, and maybe how you'd evaluate that today.
Yeah, that's a timely question, and sorry I couldn't see you asking. I'm having some technical glitches on my end, which is no surprise. But at the time, TPP was at the time, I think, a great opportunity for the United States, not just economically, because it would have expanded. A new free trade agreement would have expanded markets for American producers. but it was also intended to be an agreement that could grow, that more countries could join onto in the future, as opposed to something like NAFTA, where it's pretty much just North America, and it's really hard, be difficult for another country to join in. And every time we want to have an agreement with somebody else, we've got to renegotiate from scratch. And it was supposed to be an agreement that could grow. And what I shouldn't say nobody, but what wasn't really pointed out at the time is this is a great way to promote our interests with our allies in the Pacific Rim. And so when we pulled out, that was a tremendous loss for the United States, I believe. And unfortunately, I don't think the Biden administration is going to go back and rejoin TPP. I think it could be done. It wouldn't be easy, but they would love to have us. One of the problems with trade agreements is they get attacked from, I don't know if you want to call it the right, but Trumpists who think trade agreements, they're all bad, they're all foreigners taking advantage of us. But a lot of labor unions and environmental groups and the more left-wing groups don't feel that the losses from being in these agreements outweigh any of the economic benefits. That's another topic. But there are reasons that Democratic politicians, even though Democratic voters overwhelmingly support trade and overwhelmingly support trade agreements, they have a really vocal and financially powerful contingent that are hostile to trade. And so they're likely to battle anything like TPP. So again, a long answer to a short and very straightforward question. We negotiated a good agreement. It's not perfect. None of these agreements are perfect, just like no legislation is perfect. Certainly better in it than out of it. And I'm really disappointed we didn't take advantage of that. And it's in my opinion, handing a big victory to China as well.
All right. And that's what I was going to mention, is that void was really filled by China, and they benefited from it dramatically. And just while we're talking about, a lot of environmental groups that'll be against free trade, in a lot of cases, that creates a situation where people are very inefficiently and wastefully producing things to sell. People want to buy local all the time, but if you're, we can't make oranges here in Kansas, right? I mean, it's a waste of time and energy. And so a lot of times when you have those trade protections, it actually causes more environmental harm or more use of energy than it saves. And you have to look beyond just the first level thinking sometimes on those things. So anyway,
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I don't see any other questions from the group, but really appreciate this. And I'm thinking, we were talking earlier, it looks like this fall we're going to be completely in person and back doing things, 100%. So I know my flights to DC got delayed. I can use that credit until December. So I'm hoping that we'll set something up in the fall, and a few of the folks that were planning on going will still be here in the fall, and we'll take a new group out there and hopefully get together in person. But I really appreciate your time, and sorry the basketball stories aren't better to tell, but at least we've won a game or two, I guess, 2 in a row. So that's something.
That's right. Thank you. Thanks for everybody's time. And if anybody does have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, or Dan can give you my email. And if I can help with anything down the road, whether it's related to trade or economics, or you're visiting DC or whatever, that's something I appreciate the chance to do as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, I don't know if you can hear all our group applauding, and thanks again, Brian. We'll be in touch. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in 5 weeks. This will end this. I don't see any other questions. All right.